Hi everybody. Our host tonight is Dr. Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at UT Austin, where he is a professor in the university's Department of History and the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. He is the author of 10 books on contemporary politics and foreign policy, and he is also the host of the podcast This is Democracy, which you can find in Apple, Spotify, and all the platforms. Tonight he will be talking about our upcoming elections and foreign policy during COVID-19. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, and thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm Ronan O'Malley. I'm the Director of Programs at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and I'm delighted to be joined again by Dr. Jeremi Suri, a renowned presidential historian that we're also lucky to have right here in the state of Texas at the University of Texas at Austin. And I thank you again to my colleague Verdiana for helping us take care of all this and doing our introductions. And I'd be delighted if you all would like to join us for our next live Zoom event. That'll be next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, April 22nd. That'll be on China, the future of the Communist Party, and U.S.-China relations with former acting ambassador to China, Ambassador David Rank. He was the acting ambassador of the United States to China for, I think, about a year and a half. He has some very interesting views on China and also our role and our perspectives on that. And today, we're delighted to have a discussion with Jeremi Suri related to not just the current election, but the wider factors such as COVID-19, how that might impact the election, and maybe also, I always love talking to historians because they can give us a sense of how to put things in perspective and also to realize, are what we're seeing now, is it new, is it different, or is this perhaps something similar has happened before, or maybe we're forgetting about something. Lastly, a lot of you, have heard Jeremi before. He's very kindly spoken to the council numerous times in the past to different groups, to our young professionals groups and our general audience and to students, so everyone under the sun. Jeremi, I think it's really good for a lot of people. I think a lot of people got the book and really enjoyed the presentation on it. Could you, before we get into today's discussion, could you tell us about the Impossible Presidency, your last book regarding the history and the changes of the role of the presidency and how what the founding fathers dreamt up and where we are today with regards to the authority and really just the massive amount of power, whether intended or not, that the president must wield, reluctantly or not, now, and how it has changed so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ronan. I so enjoy coming to talk to your colleagues in Houston. You're just a phenomenal group. I speak to a lot of World Affairs Councils. You're definitely one of my favorites. Definitely one of the very, very best.
We didn't pay you very much for that.
Well, it's a mutual appreciation society. The book, The Impossible Presidency, that I wrote, that I obviously wrote before the COVID crisis, many of the arguments I made in there have manifest out today. The two real main arguments, and you referred to them already, Ronan, are about the growth of the presidency and then the difficulties of managing that growth. And in many ways, this is a metaphor for our society at large. The founding fathers, their genius in understanding our democracy was that we needed figures who brought us together, but figures who didn't actually tell us what to do. The miracle of American democracy is what James Madison called pluralism, the ability of different groups to work together. And the presidency was designed to be a very small office that played a role around a few issues, bringing people together, looking down the road at the bigger issues that mattered and mobilizing people around those issues. What I show in the book, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, looking at how presidents spend their time, looking at how presidents use resources. Over 200 years, the office grew enormously, took on more responsibility in the day-to-day management of society, from building the railroads, to managing wars, to managing a nuclear arsenal around the world, to managing economic development at home and abroad, and all these programs. The office grew enormously to the point where presidents moved away from the long-term strategic vision they were supposed to have in a small, forward-looking office to becoming crisis managers, full-time crisis managers, which means, and I think this is most clear in the last third of the book with the presidents who follow Franklin Roosevelt, you see how presidents basically spend their time each day going problem to problem, trying to kick every can down the road, trying to push off any problem that they see as jeopardizing American security, jeopardizing American prosperity. And it's in part because we're so big. The other thing is that it's not a problem of the deep state, I think. It's more that the office is so large that the issues get cut up. So presidents rarely see how things fit together. They lose sight of the larger issues. We have ideology, but ideology is not policymaking. Ideology is campaigning. Ideology is persuading people. The day-to-day management of any organization is much more complex, and presidents get lost in that. So I point to this in many cases, the Bay of Pigs being one example, Iran-Contra being another, where well-intended, talented presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan lose sight of the strategic interests of the country and also lose sight of how the issues fit together. I don't think Reagan ever fully realized how damaging the Iran-Contra deals that Oliver North and others were putting together really were. That brings us to today, because I think one of the real challenges President Trump has had is he doesn't bring the leadership experience, the administrative knowledge that some of his prior presidents had, and he's dealing with a magnificent and really terrible growth of these crises and pressures on the office. It's magnificent because it actually, I mean, it's incredible how much it is, and it's horrible because it would lead even the most talented executive to sink. And I think he's beyond sinking. And what I see in those press conferences is he's trying to catch up to what's happened each day and trying to find some way to talk about issues he barely understands. Some of those are his own limitations, but my argument is that it's also a structural problem in the office itself.
And thank you for that. And I think an excellent thing your book, The Impossible Presidency, points out is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or whatnot, or uninvolved politically, perhaps to make you gain a degree of I don't want to say sympathy, but understanding for how difficult the job of being the president is. You mentioned in the book various diaries where you show 150 years ago, presidents had time to think. They had time to actually go over the big weighty questions. And more recently, last decades, every 5-10 minutes of the day is mapped out with this meeting or that conference or whatnot. That in a lot of ways, it's just become very difficult for a president to even, as you mentioned, keep their head above water with regards to what's going on now, let alone focusing and trying to predict or organize where the country will go from here.
It's completely true. And Democrat or Republican, and most of our presidents that I can study historically, which would be the ones before this one, were incredibly talented, energetic people, but they were worn down by the office. In a way magnified that you and I are worn down every day, Ronan, right? I mean, there are more and more things put on our calendars, more and more email. We can spend all of our day in meetings and answering emails, right? And then think about what it's like to be president. What's been interesting about Trump is that he's tried to get away from this, but he hasn't, because what's happened is when he's not in those meetings, they're going on anyway. And so this is the opposite problem, right? If all of this energy is coming through the executive and you're not part of it, then the decisions are getting made for you. And what we've seen with COVID is that actually there's been an absence of leadership there. And so it's the other side of the same coin, in a sense. My argument is that we need to make the office less impossible by figuring out how to focus it on the few things that we need presidents to work on and get them away from the other things they're working on that they shouldn't be working on.
I see. And maybe lastly, you could just touch upon it and to, I suppose, promote the council a bit more. Later in May, we were supposed to host Peter Baker and Susan Glasser for their upcoming great book on basic biography of James Baker.
Yes.
One of the in recent history, one of the most effective Secretary of State and Chiefs of Staff of the United States. Can you explain how a chief of staff for a president can make a huge difference and why maybe it can lead to a more effective presidency?
Absolutely. And I have to say, I am so excited for Peter and Susan's book. I was even thinking of coming up for your event because I haven't heard them talk about it really. Mm-hmm. I think much of the success that Ronald Reagan had as president is because of James Baker. And referring back to what I just said about Iran-Contra, note that he was no longer chief of staff when Iran-Contra occurred. He was chief of staff during the first term of the Reagan administration, not the second term. James Baker was, I think, the last great chief of staff we had. What did he do as chief of staff? He helped the president to be kept out of the things he needed to be kept out of. The chief of staff is the guardian of presidential time. And the chief of staff has to make sure of two things: that the president has the time in his day, the best energy he has to focus on the things that matter most, and to make sure he's getting good factual information from all sides. And James Baker, and anyone who knows Baker, I've only met him a few times, but I've read a lot of his records. Anyone who knows him, this is a man who believes in facts, science, and seeing all the necessary information you need to see on an issue. And in a certain way, he is a genius at collecting information. So he would make sure that Ronald Reagan had the information, fair, objective information that he needed, and that he had the time to make the decisions that he would make. That job is probably the second most important job in the White House after the president.
And I will let you all know, we have rescheduled Peter Baker and Susan Glasser for October 7th. So look out for that. Hopefully by then we're allowed and able to have in-person events again. Maybe just moving to the election we're currently in. This cycle is kind of hard to even remember we're currently in the middle of election. What overall do you see as kind of the similarities between 2016 and 2020? Obviously no one is taking Trump for granted anymore. No one thinks, that this is a predictable election. How do you see the similarities and the differences between the two?
Well, I see more differences than similarities, actually, but I'll start with the similarities. The two similarities that jump out to me, the first is the most obvious one. It's still a very highly partisan environment that we're in. And as I've said it in the past at your events, partisanship is as American as apple pie. We've been partisans since the first president, since George Washington, and we were even partisan then. But this is a moment of hyper-partisanship, right? If Trump says something, those on the other side inherently want to say the opposite, and vice versa, right? And the impeachment, which is also easy to forget about, it was just a few months ago, but it seems like so long ago, that was a clear example of that. All the votes fell along partisan lines. We were partisan in 2016, we're still partisan. And then the second similarity is we are operating in this new social media space where it's very hard to know who is giving us information, what is true and what is not true, and what is being sent to us by people from other societies, particularly from Russia. And it is overwhelming, the evidence of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. I'm not saying it's changed the outcome. It's overwhelming, and I encourage people to read the Mueller report. It's detailed on this. The evidence is there. And there's a great deal of evidence the Russians are continuing to do this now, and I'm sure the Chinese and others are as well. I note anytime I write an op-ed that criticizes Vladimir Putin, my email, my social media is overwhelmed by people who don't have Russian names, but it all looks like it's coming from Russia to me. And, and I'm small potatoes. So those are the two similarities, right? The social media space and the hyperpartisanship. The differences, the most obvious one is we are now dealing with a major health crisis, and perhaps even more serious, we're dealing with a deep recession, potentially another Great Depression. Our unemployment numbers are going to be up at Great Depression unemployment numbers this summer, 25, 30%. That's extraordinary to think about. And that changes everything, because the presumption in the 2016 election was that prosperity would continue, and the presumption was that our country was safe. Now it's just the opposite. And I will say that incumbents historically have had a difficult time running when the economy is collapsing, when unemployment is high, and when Americans are dying. Those are not the conditions you want to run on. And if you don't believe me, think back to Herbert Hoover, and you'll see a lot of that. That's a big difference. Second, I think that people have seen Trump in action, and there's proof of concept. And maybe you like that, but maybe you don't. But there's something there. He didn't really have a record, Ronan, before, right? He had words. He had an image. And of course, that's still an important part of who he is, whether you like him or not like him. But he's got a record, right? And he's got to run on his record. I think Obama was reelected because even some people who didn't like him thought his record was acceptable to them, maybe. And those who voted against him probably didn't. But I do think when you're up for reelection, your record matters, which is to say you can't make everything up. And people are going to look closely at how President Trump responded to the coronavirus. They're going to look at how he's dealt with North Korea, with Iran, with China, with other countries. And I'm not saying we're all going to agree on our judgments, but his record's going to matter. And certainly his record on the economy is going to matter. And I think there's a third difference that I'd point to that might even be the very most important one. It's a new electorate. It's a very new electorate. Texas is ground zero for this. It's not just that we're a browner state with more Hispanic voters. We're also a younger state, and we have large numbers of people who have moved to the state, moved to Houston more than anywhere else. Second to Houston would be Dallas and Austin, right? Coming from other parts of the country, bringing different perspectives. The Austin and Houston miracles of this amazing economic growth until recently was in large part fueled by talent coming to our states. That changes everything. Those are voters now here. And who votes and how they vote is going to be really significant. I think our Senate race in Texas, like the last one, is going to be close because of the new voters, not because old voters are changing their mind.
And touching upon the issue of the economy, we've all heard it's the economy stupid. Outside of the war, typically speaking, economy is the number one factor driving how people make a decision with regards to if they'll vote and who they'll vote for. Is there perhaps maybe an exception or at least kind of a wait and see? We'll have to see with this regard, because perhaps in the past it's been a more gradual policy changes or decisions that led to issues in the economy that maybe a president had more of a factor in deciding. Whereas perhaps with COVID-19, do you think enough of the American population would say, well, yes, the economy collapsed and cratered, but what happened with COVID-19, leaving out the response of what the president may or may not have done, but this collapsed the global economy, everyone all over, and maybe they'd be more willing to give a kind of a grace period or so to President Trump?
I can't think of an economic example, and we've had many examples of recessions and depressions in our history. If you look back to the 19th century, I can't think of a case where it's helped the incumbent at all. Usually it undermines the incumbent. I think what Trump and his supporters have to hope for is that the economy looks like it's improving. The argument is not just what is the actual state of the economy, what are people's attitudes about it? So this is why I think there's a push to try to reopen the country, perhaps maybe too soon, maybe not too soon, because the argument there would be, yes, the economy is going to be in a much weaker state than it was a year ago, but can we show people that it's going in the right direction? That's the issue, really, right? So but I don't think you can get away from trying to convince voters that either they're better off or they will be better off. If you can't convince them of that, you're not going to get reelected as an incumbent.
And then kind of, looking towards the election itself, 2015, 2017, 15 and 16, a lot of people were looking at polling and they'd say, it's X, Y, and Z, the last few months before the election in November, people would look, the polling, Hillary clearly has a big lead, but most time people weren't saying, well, yes, that's a national polling. And despite polling mistakes, in a lot of ways, that polling was fairly accurate. She won by 3 million votes, and she won by a margin that was similar to the prediction for a national election. But a lot of people were ignoring, or maybe just not thinking about, that in reality, unfortunately, 70% of us live in states where our vote is almost, I don't say wasted, but I can tell you who's going to win in Texas and who's going to win in California. Right. But are we making the mistake again of not looking at the swing states and realizing that Trump, despite his low approval numbers, still has a strong base and still has a high degree of popularity in many of those swing states?
I think sometimes we do. We can fall into just trying to make it a horse race again, and that's so naturally attractive to us. It's simple. But I do think people have learned a lesson from 2016. And when you go to Nate Silver's site and all of these polling sites, Nate Cohn for the New York Times, they're much more sophisticated now about this. We've learned some lessons. The things I look to are turnout numbers. How eager are people to turn out? How easy is it going to be for them to vote? I think the debate we're going to have in the next few months about voting by mail, 28 states have some of that. I think 6 or 7 states allow complete voting by mail. Texas, there was just a court ruling on this here, right? These are big issues, right? Because who votes matters more than what opinion is, right? So that's part of it. And then we have the midterm election, and we even have an election last week, and that's significant, right? In the lead up to 2016, the Republicans were doing really well in these off-term elections and these local elections. It's been the opposite now, right? 2018, the Democrats do very well in the congressional elections and even in the Senate races. And you could argue that Beto O'Rourke loses to Ted Cruz, but in a certain sense, he wins, right? I mean, he gets so close. And for a city like Houston and for Harris County, he transforms your politics, right? I mean, you have a whole new set of people elected on Beto's coattails in Houston. And then last week, we had this election in Wisconsin during the COVID crisis, where it was made very difficult for a lot of Democrats to vote, especially in Milwaukee, where there were 5 polling places in the whole city. And yet the Democratic Supreme Court justice candidate beat the incumbent Republican by like 6-7 points, and won in many, many traditionally red parts of the state. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing momentum to the Democratic side. Will that carry forward? I don't know. But I think those are the markers we need to look to. I don't think anything's baked in yet. We're going to have to pay close attention to these things as we go forward. But I think the question really in the end comes down to who votes. And I think the Democrats are motivated. Will Republicans be motivated enough to come out to vote for Trump? Will suburban women come out and vote for Trump?
Um, you noted though that polling is important, but at the end of the day, turnout is
Yes.
what really decides
Yes.
who wins or loses. But part of what stimulates or can add to a great degree of turnout is having an exciting or charismatic or different candidate. You mentioned Beto O'Rourke in Texas created a huge blue wave across most of the urban centers of the state of Texas. Big waves of the Democrats coming in. The last huge big change in voter turnout for the United States presidential election. You think of Barack Obama, extremely charismatic candidate, the first African American to run for president, or even you look at Hillary Clinton, perhaps not the most charismatic or natural politician, but the first woman ever to run for president, basically for a major party in the United States. Why is it, or how is it, where we are now, that the three last men standing, Bernie didn't leave that long ago, were three old white men, and whether you love Joe Biden or hate Joe Biden, he doesn't have the natural charisma of, say, Barack Obama, and perhaps doesn't have the youthful kind of enthusiasm or voter base that, say, Bernie Sanders has. Do you think that voter turnout might be an issue because we basically have two, older white male candidates?
It could be a very big problem, and I think you raised a central issue we all have to think about, and I think many have commented on this, including Mike Bloomberg. The way our primary system is structured, it gives a small number of states that are not representative of the country as a whole, and I have nothing against those states. It gives them a disproportionate influence in fundraising and in selection of candidates. And so because Iowa and New Hampshire come early, it's very difficult for a Hispanic candidate from Texas, whether Republican or Democrat, to get a lot of traction early on, but it's a lot easier for a senator, an older white senator from Vermont or from Delaware, or a New Yorker to get traction. And so that's part of the problem. It's about the money and the ordering of the primary system. And boy, oh boy, I hope, Ronan, that after 2020, we have some real serious discussion. This primary system was created in the 70s. It's not in the Constitution. We can change it again. We could rotate it. That's part of the problem. I also think that in this disruptive time, people do look for a father figure. They look for stability. So there's a youthful energy, a desire for innovation, a desire for reform, but also a desire for stability. I think in some ways, people are looking for an Eisenhower. When Eisenhower ran in 1952, people, first of all, didn't know whether he was a Democrat or Republican at first. They just knew he was the hero of World War II. And they knew he was someone who was stable, trustworthy, and who brought order to things around him, right? That's why he was actually chosen as supreme commander in Europe as well. And I think that's what was attractive to Democrats in the end about Joe Biden. They wanted someone who they thought was likable, and he's much more likable to people than Hillary Clinton is, someone who was familiar, someone who they trusted, someone who could be a father figure, and someone who they hoped would shepherd in younger, perhaps more progressive talent on the Democratic side. So that's all a way of saying that I think his vice presidential selection is going to be really important. And back to the Eisenhower model, Eisenhower chose Richard Nixon, who was a firebrand on the right in the Republican Party at that time, almost a McCarthyite, because he knew he had to fire people up in the party. And I think that's going to be part of Biden's thinking. I think that's why he's already announced he's going to choose a woman.
And just related to that, we always, I think in the media and the general public, we have a big hype and a big kind of following of, oh, who might they pick for vice president? And once they're picked, it makes the news and the headlines for the next few weeks, during the summer. But historically, outside of certain key elections, historically, and I know it's difficult to judge because you can't take a vice president appeal off of a ticket or on a ticket, but how much influence does it actually typically have on an election?
Typically very little. I mean, there are exceptions though, and this might be one of those exceptions. And I think where it matters is less on winning a state or not winning a state. It's more your point about generating enthusiasm. Can you generate enthusiasm that way? It's hard not to think that to some extent the evangelical enthusiasm for Donald Trump is in some ways connected to Mike Pence. Mm-hmm. Do I think people voted for Trump because of Pence? No, but do I think that Pence's presence on the ticket excited evangelicals a little more? Probably yes. And so the thinking for Biden, I think, is already, he said this, right? He needs to win a vast majority of women voters. And he's really going after women in suburban areas. And that's why I think he said he's going to put a woman on the ticket. But I think he's going to try to find a woman who will appeal to those kinds of voters.
And would you like to venture a guess? Someone like Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, any leanings?
Yeah, I think that, I think those are top people, obviously. I think the governor of Michigan, Whitmer, is especially because of the way she's, first of all, looked as if she's been effective, though she has opposition, but still been effective in
Mm-hmm.
Michigan, and the way she's taken on the president. And if you want to make the handling or mishandling of the pandemic a big issue, she's a good person to have on the ticket. Stacey Abrams from Georgia looks particularly attractive. She's the only African American candidate at the state level who's increased voting in the way she has, but she hasn't been in office. So,
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of talent there. I think we've got an interesting pool right there. I don't think he'll pick someone like Elizabeth Warren, but he might surprise us. The chemistry is going to be important too. I mean, the lesson from both Bush and Obama was you choose someone who you think is appealing to your base, but someone who also you can display a partnership with. Everyone remembers how awkward it was to see Sarah Palin and John McCain.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what you want to avoid.
And lastly, on that issue, I know you're obviously, at least as far as I know, not part of the campaign. So, but despite the rumors people might have had, for instance, we hosted Nikki Haley last year. A very, very charismatic, very smart, very likable candidate. For her, I think she's looking more towards 2024. But some people have said, if Trump gets desperate enough, would he pull Pence off and put her on? What's your perspective on that? Would he do that and upset evangelicals?
I think he would be wary of doing that, but I could see Donald Trump doing that. He's also very impulsive, right? So I could see him doing it because he's angry at Pence, or wants to blame Pence for not doing well at that point in the election or something like that. So I could see him removing Pence. I could see Donald Trump doing almost anything. I have trouble imagining Nikki Haley wanting to run as Trump's vice president. When she was ambassador to the UN, she wanted to show she was on board with Trump's supporters, but she was always careful to keep a certain distance between herself and Trump. She's a very independent candidate. She's been very good at managing her brand. And I don't think she ever wants to be seen as an opponent of Trump's or not a supporter, but I think she doesn't want to be leashed to him if he goes down in 2020. And that's the advice I would give her. I mean, wait for 2024 one way or another. And I think that's probably what she'll do.
And again, maybe, turning to the election where we are now, how much of a factor do you think, you touched upon it earlier, do you think both Trump and Biden, and obviously in different ways, will make COVID-19 and U.S. relations with and or against China in these last few weeks and months be a factor in the campaign?
I think those are going to be central elements of the campaign, maybe the two most central elements, along with the economy, which is, of course, related to that. I think the Democrats are going to hammer Trump for not being well enough prepared, and they're going to play. We're all going to see over and over again the ads of Trump saying, the quotes, the images of him saying, which he did say in January and February, this is not a big deal. They're going to remind everyone that we had created in the White House and in the Pentagon and elsewhere major groups that were ready to respond, and they've been fired by the president. That's going to come up time and again. And in response, Trump is going to try to put this on the Chinese and on WHO and on others, and we're going to go back and forth on that. I do think what's going to become significant at that point also, though, is the question of, okay, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And what we haven't seen yet is any serious discussion of what do things look like, not just in the summer and fall, when hopefully you'll have your live events again, but what do things look like a year or two from now, 3 years from now? How are we as a country going to be better prepared for the future? What is it going to look like going forward? And I think that's going to be an important part of the campaign. I'm actually looking forward to that because I think that's a space for some really creative thinking on both sides.
And another thing, Verdiana had suggested, a very good question. I think one of the sad difficulties of COVID-19 in the United States and elsewhere is it's really pointing out and further is worsening kind of the economic divide in the United States in a lot of ways. A lot of ways, the people whose jobs are lost, who might have been in the informal sector, those jobs are gone. They might not get anything back. Or at a minimum, there was those sorts of jobs where you can't work from home, you can't, sign into a Zoom meeting to be working in a manufacturing plant or a poultry plant or something like that. Do you think that impact, kind of deeper impact for kind of, lower segments of the economic ladder in the United States is going to be a bigger factor in the election.
Absolutely. I mean, inequality was already going to be a big issue. Inequality in terms of earning potential, inequality in terms of the experience of the American dream for different people, inequality in educational outlook. And that is as much about class as it is about race, as your question implies. And we can see that in Houston and Austin, right? We're in a sense multiple cities within one, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be a central issue. It's highlighted also by the fact that minority communities and poor communities are not just suffering loss of income, they're suffering more death from COVID-19. So this is going to be a big issue, and the Democrats are going to claim that this is an outgrowth of policies pursued by Republican presidents and members of Congress that have increased inequality and underfunded these communities. Republicans are going to respond by saying the solution is economic growth, and the question is who will be more persuasive on that. But I think we're going to have a real discussion of inequality, which we didn't in 2016, because in 2016 everyone thought all boats could be lifted. That was really the argument that Trump was making, right? That even though he didn't convince anyone that he cared as much about the African American community as the white community, he convinced people that he would help African Americans too. Now the question is, has that really been the case? And I think we'll come back to not just COVID. We'll be looking at the hurricane issue, right? I mean, what happened in Houston? How did that affect people in Houston? How did economic issues play into that? Those sorts of things are going to come back up.
And pulling it back to foreign policy, before we wrap up, obviously it might be easy to say Trump's greatest foreign policy success or his greatest failure, but maybe a better way to put it is, outside of what we're talking about with regards to China and COVID, what do you think are the one or two things Trump is going to promote the most with regards to foreign policy that he sees as great success? And conversely, what do you see as Biden kind of latching onto as what he sees or will promote as the one or two biggest foreign policy kind of failings of the Trump administration?
Well, first of all, it has to be said that we're a long way from November, and who knows what foreign policy crisis we're going to have between now and then. As I'm sure many of your participants know, the North Koreans, it appears they've been increasing their cyber attacks and increasing their nuclear program in the last few weeks even, right? So who knows what's happening there. Iran looks as unstable as ever. So there are all sorts of crises that could arise over the summer. But putting that aside, I think Donald Trump will argue, back to your point on China, that he has taken a hard line with China and that he has been able to force the Chinese, he would argue, to renegotiate or begin to renegotiate their trade arrangements with the U.S. in a way that is, he would argue, less exploitative of the U.S. I think that's going to be the point he's going to really emphasize. He's going to make a similar argument about trade with China and the renegotiated NAFTA and things like that. And I think we'll see a lot of Peter Navarro making this case on behalf of the administration. I think the Democrats are going to emphasize the lost opportunities, and they're going to emphasize the ways in which under Donald Trump, the Middle East has become more unstable. They're going to emphasize the ways in which American relations with our key allies have deteriorated. It's extraordinary how much resentment there is to the United States and Europe and Northeast Asia. And they're going to point to the loss of America's trade position in the world. They're going to argue, I think Biden will, that many Midwestern farmers in key battleground states are suffering because of the trade war with China and elsewhere.
And lastly, it might have been the news more if we hadn't been going, these last, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months of COVID-19 dominating everything. Do you think the issue of, obviously it's kind of been in fits and starts, but the idea of some sort of truce with the Taliban and basically at some point a full military withdrawal for the United States from Afghanistan, it will be much of an election issue?
I think it should be, but I don't think it will be. I think it'll be lost. And part of that is also the historian in me who says that ending wars is less sexy in campaign discussion than the question of whether you should have been at war in the first place or how the war is being conducted. So I don't think it'll be as much of an issue unless there's some sort of flare-up of one kind or another. I think the issue of Iran will come up more because Trump will argue that Biden would go back to the Iran deal, which he probably would, and Biden will defend that. And there'll be a discussion of what should the relations with Iran be going forward, and there'll be incentives for both candidates because of their bases to emphasize that issue. So I predict we'll hear more about Iran than we will about Afghanistan.
Okay, that's great. And I always like looking towards the future, even when we are speaking with a historian who's an expert on the past. But I know, Jeremi, maybe you could let us know a little bit, and I'm already going to reserve you for whatever the publication date is, but your next book's maybe about a year and a half out. American Renewals. Could you tell us a bit about that book and kind of how it fits into your kind of incredible repertoire of presidential history?
So I'm really interested, coming out of the Impossible Presidency, on how things could be less impossible, how we could have effective leadership. And the more I look at our history, we tend to tell our story as a story of growth and prosperity over time, and of course that's true. But we've had some really rough patches. If you think about the Mexican-American War, you think about the Civil War, you think about what American society was like in 1893 when we had a deep depression almost on the scale of 1929. Of course, the depressions of 1929, and then of course the period of World War II. And even 2007, 2008, which everyone remembers, right? We've had some real difficult moments. And so what I'm doing in this new book is really trying to look at how we've dealt with difficulty, how we've dealt with moments of decline, stagnation, partisanship, and how have we come through? How have we come out better? And my argument is really an argument that goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who basically said that the genius of American society was the genius of renewal. That Americans, and Winston Churchill kind of said this too, right? Americans get it wrong quite often, but eventually they get it right. And why is that? It's because we're so pluralistic. This is the argument of the book, that during these periods of decline, what it actually does is it opens up space for new kinds of thinkers, new kinds of actors. And those actors, they're often social activists, people working in local government. They create new ideas that are then taken by national figures and used. And this is the genius of someone like Theodore Roosevelt, who's just filled with reform ideas. Where does he get these from? Well, it's talking to local activists like Jane Addams in Chicago and John Dewey in Chicago and various others, Jacob Riis in New York, and bringing those ideas, Booker T. Washington. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to actually listen to African-American educators about education and social policy. And I think we're in that space now. I hope so. And so I'm trying to write a history of how that's happened in the past, maybe as some inspiration for leaders today.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremi. This was excellent. And thank you all for joining us and watching this on YouTube. And please subscribe to our channel if you can. And if you have any questions or comments for Jeremi or for us, please feel free to post them there or to email us at programs@wachhouston.org. And maybe we'll do a follow-up with Jeremi maybe some point down the line, closer to the election itself. And yes, we'll say thank you again, Jeremi. And thank you very much to Verdiana for helping putting all of this together. And we look forward to seeing all of you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.